the problem is like people simply aren't educated about nuclear. I would say one of the reasons behind that is it's actually incredibly counterintuitive. Like nuclear power doesn't really make much sense to the human mind. So like you think of, just like a barrel of oil, and you like think about how much power that barrel of oil can make. And then you think of uranium, and if you ask somebody like what's the comparison between, how much energy you can get out of uranium and how much you can get out of, like this barrel of oil. And they'd probably say like, well, uranium seems like maybe it's like 10 times more. Like that seems like a lot. Well, it turns out it's actually like 2 million times more. But now we can actually look at China and say, okay, they have 21 reactors under construction right now. We have 2. Mm-hmm. And they're building them for 2 billion a gigawatt hour. Yeah. Whereas we're building them for 15. So there's clearly something extremely broken about our system of building nuclear capacity.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Nick Solheim. I am the COO of American Moment, and as I'm sure you've noticed, my favorite Indian is not here with me today. He has left me for fundraising travel so that we can continue to do our jobs, so you are stuck with me for today. We got a very fascinating episode, pretty unlike, I think, anything we've ever done before. You guys are definitely going to like it a lot. But before I dive into our guest, I want to plug our website, americanmoment.org. If this is your first time listening to our podcast ever, head there to learn more about our mission, our programming, all the events we have, that sort of thing. Make sure to go check that out. Also, if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, please rate and review, 5 stars only. Feel free to leave a written review as well. Every once in a while, we like to read those on the show. If you are a journalist, you are also free to rate 5 stars. And you're also free to write about this topic because it's super interesting. Today, we have in a very, very good friend of mine. I've been friends with a Mr. Isaiah Taylor for a couple years now. Got to know him actually through our former employee, Emma Waters, and he's become a great friend, resource over the years. We talk super frequently. Always been looking for an excuse to pull him in and have him on the show, and now we've got one. Isaiah is working on a great startup, basically working on nuclear energy. And so today's podcast episode is about American nuclear energy, what the Chinese are doing, how we can use energy to reshore domestic manufacturing and production of all the goods that we consume. Super fascinating episode. Isaiah is a very intelligent guy. I believe he's the first high school dropout we've ever had on Moment of Truth, which is pretty cool. We dive into that story a little bit. So Isaiah is a self-taught engineer, entrepreneur, and high school dropout. Before starting companies, the first of which he created when he was 17, Isaiah worked in software for the DoD, private defense and aerospace, and recently the world's largest hedge fund. Isaiah is now building Valar Atomics, where his goal is to revitalize the U.S. industrial base and support industrial reshoring by providing cheap and abundant energy with nuclear power. He lives in the Idaho Panhandle with his wife, Sophie, and 3 kids. We will go now to Isaiah Taylor. Isaiah, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So you know how we like to start the show. Tell us a little bit more about the great story of Isaiah Taylor, who you are and how you got where you are today.
Sure. So the great story of Isaiah Taylor is not super long yet. I'm 24, so there's a little bit in there, but much to be written, I guess. I dropped out of high school when I was 16. That is one of the more interesting things about me. But since then, I've been working on starting companies and doing software engineering for various people. I've done 2 startups. The first one was an auto shop, actually, which was super fun to start. And that company's still going and doing great. But Really, I've been, passionate for a long time about energy and the American industrial base, if you want to call it, and expanding that. I think a lot of my, professional work has been in engineering, and then my, personal research has been into energy and, how the United States does that in the next 20, 30, 50 years.
So I don't think we've ever had anybody on the show before who dropped out of high school. And I think that that's a very interesting perspective to have. Tell us a little bit more about like the decision tree there,
Yeah, sure.
how that happened.
Sure. So, honored to be the first high school dropout on the show. Fingers crossed. So during basically like middle school and early high school, I did some homework, but not a ton of homework. And mostly was doing actual like software engineering projects first, just for myself and my own interest. And then I actually started contracting. There are various freelance sites that you could sign up for, and just list a little portfolio and get jobs here and there. I would actually I went to a school where you weren't allowed to have computers or phones or anything like that. But I would take a notebook and I'd write out, what the client needed. On my notebook, and then I'd have my book open for whatever history class, and I'd be writing code in my notebook, and I'd get home from school, and instead of doing my homework, I would be typing up the code that I'd written in my notebook during class.
And you're like 15, 16 at this point?
14, 15.
Man.
And I was just having fun. It started off just having a ton of fun. I remember at one point my dad told me, hey, like, you're gonna start making money with this. And I was like, you realize like I'm having fun, right? They're not going to pay me to have fun all day. That's really how it started out. Eventually, when I was 16, I got connected to like a local chat group of developers and kind of started talking to people in there. And someone just said, hey, I need a junior developer to come work on this. Met the guy in a Starbucks, showed him some of the stuff I'd worked on, and he hired me right out of high school. Dropped out, I think, the next week. And really haven't looked back since.
Wow, that's crazy. And how did you get into, from being a junior developer to startup? Again, especially in such a condensed period of time. How did that happen?
Yeah, I've always had just an extremely high sense of urgency about things. I love starting things. As soon as I have an idea, I want to see them through, and then I want to see them happen as quickly as possible. For me, like I said, software started out really being something fun to do. And then it, ended up being something to build companies around. But I think I've always wanted to create businesses, create technology. That's sort of what I've been interested. Actually, if there are parents listening, I'm sure there's lots of parents with young kids. I think one of the things that was really influential for me was actually my parents really had only like one or two things in my room. One was like a box of Legos. And then the other one was the illustrated encyclopedia of science and technology. And it's like, I think a 20 volume set. And it was just like the one shelf that was at like eye level for me in my bedroom. So I would just read those constantly and was super interested in it. So, the like traditional school path, I actually went to a great school. I had a fun time, but I think I've always sort of felt that you have to do your own research. You have to understand things from first principles, and especially that anybody can do that. I think that's one of the most important, beliefs that I have, is like anybody can actually go and understand any field, all the way down to the physics, all the way down to the math. And there's a lot of accumulated, knowledge in any specific field. And it's good to go and learn that knowledge and learn those best practices. But like everybody can understand why something happens the way it does, why something is built the way it's been built, that sort of thing.
So we've frequently had startup founders on the show before. So quick digression from what I know we're going to get into. What do you think about startup culture in general? Like, I think there are some strengths there, some weaknesses, but being a founder yourself, what's your take on it?
Yeah, I would say this. I mean, start with the strengths. Startup culture, right, has affected everything around us, I would say, in an incredible way. Like, I'm wearing an Apple Watch. I've got an iPhone, on the table over there. That iPhone has 50 apps on it. Like, I got here via Uber. Like, it's everywhere in our lives. I think Uber especially is like hilarious because it's just how you get anywhere in a city at this point. And you do it on your phone, just like Steve Jobs in a garage. And then somebody built an app. And then there's people running around on their iPhones and their Androids also using these apps. Not to mention, social media and these other things, but like it's extremely embedded into how we live as Americans at this point, and even in other countries. What, people in their garages do in Silicon Valley ends up affecting the entire world. And I would say that's like the huge positive of that is the fact that in startup culture, which is distributed outside of California now, it's everywhere. I live in northern Idaho. There's a mentality that if something is broken, you can fix it. And I think that's probably like the single most positive thing that has come out of that whole ecosystem is like responsibility taking. So just looking at a problem, looking at society, saying that thing's broken, and looking at sort of a field of heroes that have fixed broken things before. So that's a huge positive. On the negative side, certainly some things can get commercialized that maybe shouldn't have been. Like social media has, you can debate about the positive and negatives of that. I would say on the personal level for founders, there can also be a negative, which is getting caught up in like chasing quick wealth. Like a lot of crypto ended up there, even though like I love the goals of crypto, that has become like 90% of the ecosystem is like trying to get rich really, really rapidly. And I definitely think part of my early motivation, like starting companies, had to do with that. And it's really good to get a couple of like difficult failures under your belt, because it'll make you realize that chasing that is like not worth it. The wealth is good, like wealth is great, but chasing it in like the short term, I'm going to do this startup, I'm going to raise $100 million, I'm going to sell it for 500 2 years later, like that'll get really old to chase really, really fast.
So tell us more about what it is exactly that you're doing now.
Yeah, so this is a project that I think I kind of kicked off 5 years ago in my spare time. It's really been my passion project. It's been something that I've sort of had in the back pocket, is like, I'm going to do this once I've made it. Actually, it's kind of how I always thought about this. And, recently just kind of looked around at my life and realized like, I live in the most incredible time in the history of the world, the most incredible country in the history of the world. I have made it in every meaningful sense. And I would say every American, who has a loving family, like has made it. Like we've made it, everybody, like this is the wealthiest.
So back.
we are so back. This is the wealthiest nation in the history of the world. So there's more to say about that, and I'll say more about that in a little bit. But yeah, so the company that I'm doing now is Valar Atomics. That is a Lord of the Rings reference. And our goal with Valar is to reduce the price of electricity in the United States for American homes and factories. Factories especially is a huge goal of mine. I want people to have cheap power to manufacture goods in the U.S. This is something that I think people underrate and underappreciate, is that electrical input cost is sometimes the place that competitiveness breaks down with other countries. So China's electrical cost is sitting at around 7 cents a kilowatt hour, and the US is sitting at like 12.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So there's like a natural advantage built in there, even, outside of the labor and tooling and factories and all that kind of stuff that China has or other countries have. Just the energy cost alone is this like huge component into the cost of any physical good. And so, yeah, I want to massively reduce energy costs in the United States. And the way I want to do that is with nuclear power. But unlike any other nuclear startup that I know of, I want to do it by actually synthesizing hydrocarbons. So hydrocarbons are, like they sound like hydrogen and carbon. We're talking about petroleum. We're talking about natural gas. Coal is an example of a heavier hydrocarbon. And these are incredibly energy dense liquids or gases in the case of nat gas that power 90% of our world. Our cars use them, our planes use them, if you're getting electricity, here, actually there's a fair amount of nuclear around here, but most of the United States is powered by burning natural gas and turbines. So these hydrocarbons really, propel our world forward. They're how we eat and how we live. And I think they're a fantastic thing. I want them to be cheaper, though. I want them to be 10 times cheaper. And I think we can do that by synthesizing them with nuclear power.
So zooming out a little bit, you said you've been thinking about this for 5 years.
Yeah.
What's the story? How'd you first get into this?
So I've been interested in nuclear for a very long time because my great-grandfather was a top nuclear physicist on the Manhattan Project.
Wow.
So that's, just a huge family legacy. One of my most prized possessions of all time is my great-grandmother, his wife, at my dinner table in Colorado, back when I lived in Colorado. She was talking about, growing up, and started talking about her father's, Ford Model T and this kind of stuff. And I turned on my Apple Watch recorder. Mm-hmm. And we just started talking. She talked about living at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. So this city that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers just created overnight in the woods of Tennessee. They drew a circle on a map in Tennessee. It was all just, a mountain ridge called Oak Ridge. And they said, we're going to put a city there. And over the course of 3 years, it grew from, a bunch of trees to a town of 60,000 people. And that's always been just an incredible inspiration, just, hearing about them living there and raising children there, even in the midst of this, great national project that is, I think, just a testament to the energy of our nation that we can, put something together of that scale. Mm-hmm. So that was always an inspiration to me growing up, nuclear specifically. The rest of the project, I think, was actually pretty organic, where I just started looking into how do we reduce electricity cost. And the particular reason I was interested in that is I started looking at the development of artificial intelligence and robotics, and started thinking about what does the global economy look like in 5, 10, 15, 20 years when artificial intelligence has, reached a certain point and robotics have reached a certain point. I'm sort of projecting that the cost of power is going to become even more important than it is now. It's already important, but it's going to become 10 times more important, because if you think about how our factories are going to change, Tesla's already doing this. They've got, their Optimus robots walking around moving boxes. They're starting to actually use robotics on the floor. What that means is physical goods are going to be less about labor cost, and they're going to be more about power cost. And so I think if the United States wants to be competitive, which of course we do, this is the greatest nation on earth, so we should win, we're going to need cheaper power. And so that's something I started looking into 5 years ago. And Valar, I think, is the sort of output of, I think this is my 6th or 7th iteration of how we fix electrical cost in the U.S. And I'm really happy with this one. So
why is, generally speaking, American power per kilowatt hour more expensive than some of these other nations? Is it regulation? Surely it isn't a lack of resources.
No.
What's the deal?
That's a great question. When I was walking into your studio, there's a light post out there, and it's got a poster on the light post, and it says, "Tell the EPA to act now. Add power station regulations." And it's got a picture of smokestacks with carbon coming out the smokestack, and it's got a phone number to call. And I'm not sure, maybe they got a march going or something like that. That's a great picture of why electricity costs more here than it does in China. If you look at sort of the philosophy between the two nations, China has no qualms about burning coal as fast as they get it, as dirty as they get it. They have no qualms about drilling as much natural gas as they can get their hands on, refining oil and burning it, no qualms. The United States, obviously, we have this sort of national conscience about atmospheric gases and heat and all these sorts of things, which China always is sort of signaling and sort of virtue signaling toward that. But there's not much behind it. 47% of all coal plants that have been turned on in the last 3 decades are China's Belt and Road Initiative, going to African countries, Asian countries, building new coal plants. They're basically the only ones left who are building coal plants. So yeah, like they have a very different like moral philosophy around energy. They have no, shame about energy and using it for transportation and food and whatever it needs to be used for. And then the secondary thing is like they're, a command economy. So like they can just order more plants to be built. But I think it's actually the bigger one is that like philosophical difference.
Mm-hmm. And what's the mix of our, energy resources currently?
Yeah.
Like, you don't have to give exact numbers,
yeah,
but
so
generally speaking.
About 6 or 7% of our electricity generation in the U.S. is nuclear. About 40% is burning natural gas in turbines. I believe around 20% is hydroelectric. There's a small amount of just like burning petrol. And there's just like a little bit of wind and solar. So,
and has nuclear, is 7%, 6 or 7%, like the highest it's ever been? Did we experience
no,
more of a boom in the past?
We have over the last 10 years decreased our nuclear fleet by 10%. And actually, we just turned on the first new nuclear power plant in the U.S. A month ago in Georgia. It's the first one we turned on in 30 years. So we have not turned on a new nuclear power plant, other than this one, for 30 years. And obviously we've shut some down in that time because they retire eventually. And if you look at the cost of that, so they just turned on a 1.1 gigawatt nuclear power plant in Georgia. There's a twin that's coming alongside it. That's another 1.1. So you're looking at 2.2 gigawatts. And they spent $30 billion to turn on 2.2 gigawatts of power capacity. Now you look at what China's doing. They are basically spending $2 billion per gigawatt. Mm-hmm. So we're looking at $15 billion per gigawatt versus $2 billion per gigawatt. And that's the entire answer to why we aren't building more nuclear.
Yeah. Is it just environmental regulations, or is it like, I could see an argument that American nuclear power plants are safer, generally speaking, than the ones in China, but also that there are more burdensome regulations around them.
Yeah, who is it that says scale, what is it? Quantity has a quality all its own. I can't remember who said that, but there's actually something safer about doing something a lot than doing it a little. We'll have to see what China's safety record is like on their nuclear power plants, but I would not be at all surprised if there's a negligible safety difference. And we're talking about 7 or 8 times the cost. Yeah. Really what it comes down to, this is sort of like a fundamental thing that I realized in my research over the last 5 years, is the United States simply doesn't want nuclear power plants in their backyard. Like the people don't want it. People have, I saw a survey that said like 60% of French people, and like France has been on 75% nuclear power. That's like 75% of their electricity generation. Even so, 60% of French people thought that nuclear power was a carbon emitter. So like it's got terrible press. Like nuclear is terrible press. We all have images in our minds of 3 Mile Island and Fukushima. These things are like burned into our minds. We think about the atomic bomb. So nuclear has bad press. That bubbles its way up into the regulatory environment, and we get senators who will not even think about it, and representatives who won't even think about it, which means that we get the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, being somewhat set in its ways. And to their credit, actually, like I don't pin everything on the people running these regulatory agencies. I tend to think that the regulators actually have to be driven by external forces. There has to be entrepreneurs who are like pushing the envelope on regulation. There has to be congressional support. There has to be presidential support. Like the regulators are going to kind of fit a solution that fits the climate, right? And by the climate, I mean how everyone feels about it. And the problem is like people simply aren't educated about nuclear. And I would say one of the reasons behind that is it's actually incredibly counterintuitive. Like nuclear power doesn't really make much sense to the human mind. So like you think of, just like a barrel of oil, and you like think about how much power that barrel of oil can make. And then you think of uranium, and if you ask somebody like what's the comparison between, how much energy you can get out of uranium and how much you can get out of, like this barrel of oil. And they'd probably say like, well, uranium, it seems like maybe it's like 10 times more. Like that seems like a lot. Well, it turns out it's actually like 2 million times more.
Really?
Yeah. And that doesn't make sense to our minds. Like we just can't picture that. So like for all these reasons, nuclear power in the US, I think it's going to take a long time until we can onshore nuclear in an efficient way with our existing regulatory process. And so that's why I'm really focused on doing nuclear power, but doing it outside of, people's backyards, doing it far away from, where Americans are living, which means outside of the immediate concern of regulators who are put in place to protect the public, and actually do it possibly in the ocean, possibly, on container ships, and generate hydrocarbons, which are already used, like distributed out the, throughout the US. We've got nat gas pipelines, we've got tanker, trucks for petrol, this sort of thing. So I think there's an opportunity here to, maybe hack it a little bit.
Yeah. What would the international regulations on something like this be?
Yeah.
If you like, say you take a container ship and float a bunch of like nuclear reactors into the middle of the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah.
Like what are people going to say about that?
So like Russia's doing that, right? So
Yeah.
the first answer is like, it depends on which great power you're doing it like by. China just put a nuclear power plant in Pakistan. They put one in South Africa. So like in half of the world, the China influenced half of the world, they do whatever they want. Russia does whatever they want. And a big reason for that is that they actually control a lot of the uranium supply, which is, us kicking ourselves in the foot like we always do. But I would say in the sort of US half of the world that's influenced by, our regulators, I think that there is a lot of other nations looking to us to take the lead. So for instance, if you're an American nuclear startup, other nations might want to see that you passed through the American, regulatory approval process.
Because it's kind of like the gold standard.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. It's like, well, if you got through the NRC, then sure, you can operate it here. I am really excited, though. There are lots of other regulatory environments popping up. So Canada has one that's much faster, much more innovative, and Australia as well. So there are new regulatory environments being created. And, my goal is like an American entrepreneur. I love the United States. I want to, give the US people incredibly cheap energy. But if we have to do it, sort of outside of the normal place that a American startup would build nuclear, in order to give that to them, I'm perfectly fine with that. And I hope that it'll sort of motivate regulators to understand that there is really, really fundamental technology here that can transform our way of life.
So going back in time a little bit, you have the creation of the atomic bomb in 45.
Yeah.
What is the history of American nuclear energy? Like what? Yeah. Where did we go from there?
Yeah.
To where we are now?
Yeah. Great question. So, yeah, nuclear power came right out of nuclear, weapon development, and a lot of it actually came out of the same lab. So like Oak Ridge National Laboratory became a nuclear power laboratory after it was used for the synthesis of uranium in the Manhattan Project. Los Alamos National Lab, again, turned into a really big center for nuclear research. And in the 10, 15 years after World War II, we really created an incredible set of technologies for nuclear power, actually. Like those labs really went crazy with figuring out all of the ways that we can use nuclear power for really incredible things. They went down the paths of like, what's the most efficient we can possibly get nuclear energy? Can we synthesize new materials out of it? Can we, create atoms that we didn't have access to otherwise through, splitting atoms and neutron capture and these sorts of things? And it's really incredible to go back and read those reports. So, reading PDFs on the U.S. Department of Energy from 1962, and just the spirit of innovation that those people had was amazing. And the attitude of like, yes, we can actually go build this with our hands. Like if you look at what the early nuclear reactors were like, it was literally just like teams of people in some sheds with normal industrial equipment, like
smashing atoms together.
Exactly. Yeah. Or forging the nuclear core themselves, and processing the uranium and putting it in and creating the pumps and all this kind of stuff. And at some point we transitioned, like the rest of the energy economy did, to being an extremely highly regulated thing. And that changes the dynamic from like, we can build these things and we can build them fast and cheaply, to it takes 15 to 20 years to turn these things on, and they cost 8-9 times more than they should, and they overrun budget, overrun time, and then we just end up doing it less. So there's definitely been a regulatory burden that's been placed on the entire industry that has slowed it down significantly.
What were other nations doing during that same time period? Like you mentioned, France is 75% nuclear powered.
Yeah.
Where did they go right, I guess, in being able to make that jump so quickly?
Yeah, the French example is pretty incredible. If you look at their graph of like what their electricity was and then what it became, it was almost all natural gas, like everybody is. A lot of that, I believe, came from Russia. Don't fact check me on that, but I think most of it was probably from Russia. And in the space of about like 8 or 9 years, it became 75% nuclear. They just said, yeah, this is a great technology. One of the French diplomats has said, like, every country has its own natural resources. The natural resource that France has for energy is a populace that likes nuclear. That's their natural resource, because the fact is nuclear energy is just so incredible. It's really just a perception problem. Yeah.
And how about the Russians and the Chinese? What were their developments like over that time period?
The Russian nuclear energy program also came out of their weapons program, and they have continued to invest in it and are currently working on remote fission as well, something that something that they're willing to be very experimental on and operate in a way that benefits themselves. They, similar to China, they've had setbacks based on the nature of their economy, but on the flip side, are less apologetic about it. I think that's one of the biggest issues is we can't be apologetic about energy. Energy is how we live. Energy is great. I like to point out the sun, our sun is putting out more energy every second than the entire human race has ever used. So if you add up all of the energy we have ever used as a human race, the sun releases that into the void every second. So energy actually is not something we should be thinking about as if it's a constrained resource. And other countries of the world, China, Russia, don't think of it that way. They think of it as a way to, propel their industries and make things cheaper for their people. On the flip side, though, they're not as innovative as we are. And they're always sort of following what we're doing. China, notoriously just steals everything that we do and copies us, a couple of years later. But even so, they haven't even caught up to some of our most innovative ideas. We've been, even just in the 60s and 70s, creating concepts for nuclear, which are, 20, 30 times better than even the existing nuclear power plants that are being built today in the US. And I think that it's just an issue of, we have to have the collective will as a nation to embrace that, embrace low energy cost. And particularly entrepreneurs like myself who can push it forward.
What are the other, speaking of entrepreneurs, what are the other big players in this space? Or has it mostly been kind of regulated out of existence, where there are just a couple conglomerates?
It's both. It's both been regulated out of existence, and there are players. NewScale is a company that just got its reactor design approved by the NRC a couple weeks ago. It's a traditional nuclear reactor, light water reactor. And, OKLO is a recent one that announced a project at the Idaho National Laboratory. There are, I would say there are a lot of nuclear projects. I think all of them are sort of going up against the regulatory environment and trying to just sort of do it slowly over 20 or 30 years. Mm-hmm. That seems to be the consensus right now. It's like eventually the consensus on nuclear energy will change because it has to, because nuclear is so good, right? Mm-hmm. And even though I think that they're right in the long term, I think we can move 10 times faster. This is going back to like sense of urgency, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not willing to wait, 20 years for us to get cheaper energy, especially as AI and robotics develop so quickly. Like we're already starting to see the LLM type systems with AI where they're starting to exhibit more general intelligence, mating that with advanced robotics. What that means is you actually have a somewhat, generally intelligent robot that can do a bunch of things on a factory floor. If you translate that, out to 10, 15 years of building factories, like energy costs is going to become very, very important. And so I think we need to move 10 times faster on nuclear than we currently are.
So these guys that are making basically a 20, 30-year bet, as you've said, that the market's going to kind of turn in their favor in that time period, are these like organizations that are affiliated with like DARPA, or are they like just guys with super deep pockets? Mm-hmm. Like what's the...
Yeah. How
can they afford to wait that long?
Yeah. A lot of them are guys with super deep pockets. A lot of our, great American industrialists have backed a lot of these projects. Gates has been putting money into nuclear for a really long time. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of a, it's almost a philanthropic thing at this point to put money into nuclear. You're like, we need power. And so this is something that should be invested in. There are other companies in the class of like small modular reactors that I think are more immediately financially viable because you can actually sell them to the US government. So you can say, hey, this military installation needs power, buy our modular reactor that we put on site and we'll power this military installation, that sort of thing.
And when you say modular, like how big are we talking?
So like there's a startup out there called Radiant that has one that'll fit in a semi-truck trailer.
Wow.
Yeah. And like it'll power, it'll power a small military installation. It'll power, a small town in West Virginia just off of a semi-truck trailer. And that sort of thing is amazing. But again, like they have to go up against so much regulation. They have to convince, if you want to put a nuclear power plant somewhere, you're not just getting the NRC to say that you can build it. You have to talk to a city council with concerned citizens on it. You got to talk to a zoning board. You're going to talk to a state. You're going to talk to US government and then the IAEA. So there's like 6 layers of regulators that you have to talk to put anything that's doing nuclear fission anywhere in the US. So I kind of go back to like the SpaceX Tesla model, which is, I think regulatory bodies kind of have to look to entrepreneurs to see how things really ought to be done. Mm-hmm. Like the regulators on nuclear at the end of the day really just don't want there to be a terrible meltdown that like kills a bunch of people. Like that's what they're trying to avoid. And they don't necessarily know the right way to do this. They're on top of the latest technologies, but like they don't have the vision of the future, which is the entrepreneur's job. Mm-hmm. So for instance, like molten salt reactors are basically not able to melt down. There's this incredible property that again was discovered in the 60s in Oak Ridge National Laboratory. We basically invented a nuclear power station that can't melt down. But we haven't built it because of this crazy regulatory environment. So it's like this chicken and egg where they don't build it because of the regulations, and the regulations are stringent because it's old technology that's more dangerous.
Yeah.
So someone's got to break out of that cycle.
So what do you think is the appropriate level of regulation? Like, surely there should not be no regulation, right? On doing like, that meme about building a nuclear reactor in my backyard or whatever, or in my basement. What do you think the appropriate level should be?
What I would love to see is certain governors saying we are creating a safe space for innovation in various sectors. Like I think that there should be a city or, a group of cities or several counties that are like, this is an innovation zone for this thing. And the people who live here like understand there's probably elevated risks of this class of innovation. And I think that like when our founders created this federalist model where there's different like competing local governments and there's different like shifting balances of power, where California gets really bad because they're doing a bad job of running the state, and so people move to Texas. Like there's this natural balance going on. Unfortunately, we don't have that for nuclear because it's all regulated at the very top. And so I do think one of the things that could be really helpful, other than, just getting a general change in mindset from the administration, would be specific governors allowing things to happen in their state, which are more experimental. And then the second thing is what I'm doing, which is just saying, you know what, the whole, body of regulation is just too burdensome to do this cheaply. We're going to do it, in the ocean where it's not going to melt down on anybody. We're going to do it extremely cheaply. And then we're going to sell the hydrocarbons back to the mainland.
So is that the case of what happened in with this reactor in Georgia that you were talking about, that the governor was more open to it than other governors might have been?
No, the Georgia reactor, it's a Vogtle 3. It followed the normal regulatory process through the NRC and, through everything. And I mean, that's why it cost $30 billion.
Yeah.
Like that's, and that's $17 billion over budget. So more than double the budget. It was supposed to turn on in 2016 and they found a leak in one of the seals and it's been 7 years. So like that's, it's an unbelievable broken industry, and people have been pointing that out. Like engineers have been pointing that out for a long time and having a hard time convincing, anybody of that because it's just such a highly technical topic. But now we can actually look at China and say, okay, they have 21 reactors under construction right now. We have 2. And they're building them for $2 billion a gigawatt hour.
Yeah.
Whereas we're building for 15. So there's clearly something extremely broken about our system of building nuclear capacity.
Yeah. One of the things I picked up on right away when you first started talking about this, especially as you were starting to talk about the, using robotics on manufacturing floors and that sort of thing, is the possibility that, if we were able to lower these energy costs, that we would be able to make things in America again for much more cheaply than we're able to now.
Totally.
So tell us a little more about that and the particular industries that are kind of ripe for disruption there.
So I think that nuclear power, or let's just say really cheap electricity, and I think nuclear power is the way to do that, but really cheap electricity is one of the easiest things that we can do to start decoupling and start competing with China. And there are, a few industries that are super ripe for that. There's been a lot of drama recently because we're trying to, reshore semiconductors, but some of the material inputs for semiconductors, China controls 97% of the market. So gallium and germanium are 2 elements that we really need, and for the CHIPS Act to get chips back on shore. But China has 97% of the supply, and they're starting to restrict the supply.
And is that supply coming primarily from African countries or within their own borders?
So a lot of it is coming from their own borders, but we have basically gallium is a product of the aluminum process. When you're processing aluminum, you get gallium as part of an electrolysis process and it's just extremely power intensive. That's what it comes down to. So there's plenty of the raw ore in the earth. Like it's in Australia, we have it in the US, like it's in Georgia, it's all over the place. But in China, they can get a coal furnace to get extremely hot, and they can use that for heat processes, and then they can, turn that into really cheap electricity. And we're not doing that in the US. So there's just a natural market incentive for China to have 97% of that market, because so much of that cost is driven by how cheap is the power. So I think there's a huge opportunity on rare metal supply chains that are driven by like high power cost processing to be completely reshored. And I think that will also, like I said, it's actually less of an issue of where the ore comes from. Like Australia has massive, ore deposits. There's plenty of countries in Africa that we can buy from, plenty of countries in South and Central America. But we really need to take the lead on this. Like to use Africa and South America as an example, like again, with the Belt and Road Initiative, like China is building power plants for them. They are becoming deeply indebted to China. China's invested $800 billion into infrastructure in, China, in Africa and South America. And it's a debt trap, right? Mm-hmm. So they are going out and it's coal, it's gas, it's nuclear. They are trying to sort of capture these supply chains through debt. And I think that's a shame. It's a shame because we could do so much better. It's a shame because there's no technical limitation here. In fact, I would argue they get everything from us anyway. Like American laboratories are where they get it. The Los Alamos National Laboratory, where Oppenheimer was working on the atomic bomb, it has since become a research facility. And recently it was revealed that over the last 2 decades, 150 scientists from the Los Alamos lab went to China and have basically brought all of the research and tech that they were working on at Los Alamos into China. So, and again, it's like, there's no technical limitation here. We have all the ore we need. We have all the tech we need. We have the smartest people in the world. We can build things better than anyone else in the world. The only thing that's like standing in our way is the national will to do it, entrepreneurs to get it done, and regulators to help us out.
So is China using currently a lot of these more advanced designs that you say people have been working on and been unable to accomplish here because of the regulation? Have they been doing some of that over there?
That's the interesting thing is that no, for the most part, they have not been using advanced designs. This is a pretty common thing for China, is like they copy something that's pretty well established for us, and then they do it way cheaper because they have less regulation and they can just, order it done, order everyone out of the way. And I think that's really ironic. Like they're putting $400 billion into building nuclear power plants, but we have entrepreneurs here who know how to build power plants 100 times better. Mm-hmm. And I think that's just a great like image of how much we are, getting in our own way, that like we know how to do these things at such an incredible level. Like we really do have the best talent in the world for nuclear, for manufacturing, for everything. The only thing that we don't have is like the actual infrastructure to get it done, the tooling, the factories, the zoning. We even have the capital markets. In fact, like China relies on our capital markets to get their infrastructure problems done, or their infrastructure projects and manufacturing projects. Like if you work with Chinese developers and suppliers to create a new, create something in manufacturing, like it's pretty likely that the capital is actually coming from here. Mm-hmm. So like, that's such a shame. It's such a shame that our capital is going over there. Our IQ is going over there. Our IP is going over there. We could so easily do it here with the right regulatory environment.
Are they, the Chinese, implementing any of these kind of advanced robotic systems for manufacturing that you've been talking about?
Yeah. Okay. So, China has what I would call the Manhattan Project going on over there in 2 areas. One is AI and another is robotics. So they have a national scale project to take the lead with AI and robotics. And the reason for that is somewhat obvious. On the one hand, it's like, you want to lead on manufacturing. The thing I think people sort of discount and don't realize is like China has a huge demographic problem on their hands. Mm-hmm. It's estimated by the end of the century that they'll only have half of their population count. So if you're in China's position and that's the reality that you're facing, you want to decouple labor from your manufacturing dominance. You want labor to be a smaller factor in your ability to produce goods cheaper than anybody else, and you want cheap energy. So I like to point out there's like 3 pillars of any manufacturable good. I've got a coffee cup here, I've got an Apple Watch, I've got a microphone. All 3 of these things have 3 pillars. They are intelligence, energy, and dexterity. So energy, you just need the kinetic, ability to manipulate matter. Intelligence, you need to be able to put it together in the right way to make it work. And dexterity is the ability to, actually move things in physical space. Mm-hmm. So that's how all physical products have been made since the beginning of time. It used to be that humans did all three of those things. So like intelligence in your mind, energy from the food you eat, dexterity with your fingers. That's like pre-industrial revolution. And then in the industrial revolution, we started moving some of the dexterity over to machines. So mm-hmm. you have, looms, and you've got various like mechanical processes that are really repeatable. But for the most part, the intelligence of those processes is still in our minds. And the energy actually started switching over to, coal and gas and that sort of thing. I think what we're on the verge of now, and this is what the United States needs to wake up to quickly, and what China already has woken up to, is that the next revolution, I think, is all about the intelligence and the dexterity finally catching up. And what that means is you're going to have intelligence that you can actually just pay for with energy, mm-hmm. instead of having to hire humans, which have their own scale limits, and you constantly have to deal with the limitations of their outputs and paying them, and all those sorts of things. You can actually just pay for intelligence from a computer. You can pay for dexterity from a robot. And at the end of the day, that means that how much your electricity costs, how much your heat costs, is like directly proportional to how much the output good costs. So yeah, I mean, they have an incredible effort with both robotics and AI. I think the AI one is a little easier to see. Like, they have constantly shocked everybody on all of their iOS apps on the App Store, like mm-hmm. the TikTok algorithm and these sorts of things, and some of the facial recognition technologies that they're using and starting to deploy in like African countries to allow dictators to identify their citizens and that sort of thing. It's a massive, massive priority for them. On the robotics side, like, they've filed 3 times more robotics patents than we have every year for the last like 5 years. They just put out their 5-year plan on robotics. So like they're awake to this, and we need to be as well. So
on the American side, we do have a population problem coming down the pike right now, though certainly not as drastic as theirs.
Yeah.
One problem that I can foresee here is like what you do with American manufacturers mm-hmm. and workers that are currently in those kinds of factories. What do you suggest we do with them?
With the workers themselves?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that our manufacturing class is aging out. I think it's going to be less a question of what do we do with them and who do we replace them with when they retire. I think that's a much bigger problem than what do we do with them. I mean, my personal thought on the people who are in our manufacturing base is like, they are in manufacturing because they want to see, the United States produce incredible products for its people. Like, we want to be able to drive cars. We want to be able to, visit our relatives and communicate with phones and these sorts of things. So I don't think there's a conflict there. I know sometimes in conservative viewpoints, there seems to be a conflict between the march of technology and sort of leaving behind a class of workers. But I think our problem is going to be the exact opposite. Like, there are not enough people to build all of the things that we have exported to China and that we need to bring back.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very interesting. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, how all of this, all the work that you're doing in our nuclear industry in general could help with our energy independence.
Yes.
Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah. I mean, energy independence is one of the biggest things that is facing us right now. And it's a shame because so much of it is driven by our own internal fears and conflicts, and has less to do with real physical constraints and more to do with politics. But I think that we can break out of it. So right now, we import gas, we import petrol, and we import a fair amount of uranium as well. And for a while there, we were like, during Trump, we were a net oil exporter. Now we're not anymore. We have this like volleyball relationship with energy. And it keeps putting us into really weird situations. We, had Biden going and meeting MBS and doing this weird fist bump. And then now like gas costs $5. So what's going on with that? And OPEC is dropping. So like, we need to get out of this volleyball game. And the way that we do that is not switching to wind. It's not switching to waves. It's not switching to solar. As much as people would love that for that to be the solution, it's just not. And the reason is our entire economy runs on hydrocarbons. We need hydrocarbons. People think of the energy grid. Like if I say the energy grid in the US, what you think of is electricity, right? You think of like cables stretching between houses and towns to a power station. That energy grid is actually pretty small compared to this shadow energy grid that we have, which is natural gas. We have a massive volume of natural gas moving through our pipelines underground. They power our power stations. They, come and power your heat and your AC in your home, your stove. So hydrocarbons are just massively integrated into how our economy works. There's just really, really great natural advantages to them. They're highly energy dense per weight and per volume. And we have just a huge amount of infrastructure that can utilize them in ways that make humans' lives better every single day. So it's not going to be this like sudden transition away from importing oil. Now, could we start drilling all of our own oil? Absolutely. And we totally should. We should be drilling our own oil. We should be fracking our own gas. And I think that's like, yes, definitely do that. That said, even, oil and gas is a different kind of energy dependency. It's not depending on other nations, but it is depending on natural resources, and it's depending on sort of the fickleness of markets. So like one of the things that happens in gas and oil and gas markets is like entire companies get clobbered and go bankrupt with price swings. And that really affects the price, and we get these terrible fluctuations. And the reason is oil and gas is just difficult to extract from the ground. You're having to constantly do construction projects. So I have actually a massive amount of admiration for the existing like oil and gas industries. Like I think we owe so much of our lives and what we do and the ability to, see our relatives from states over. I got here on a plane. I woke up at 2:30 this morning in Moscow, Idaho, and I flew here to Washington, D.C. That is like completely downstream from so many people working in hydrocarbon industries. So I think the way that we get energy independence is not to get away from hydrocarbons. It is to produce our own hydrocarbons on our own terms. We use nuclear fission, which has just unbelievable margins as far as like uranium is incredibly cheap, and it produces an incredible amount of heat, and you can convert that heat to natural gas and to petrol at very low cost, and it's completely stable. It's not dependent on other countries. It's not dependent on politics. It's not dependent on, constant exploration of new areas, construction, EPA regulations, local, towns saying we don't want to drill here, we don't want to well there. It's independent on all fronts, foreign and, in a certain sense, independent of geography as well.
Yeah, as you've said earlier in the episode a couple times, I think a lot of it comes back to public opinion.
Yes.
Basically just the way that people think about energy, whether that's oil, natural gas, or nuclear. What do you think is the best way? Surely it's not just like a massive PR campaign. Maybe it's just success. But what do you think is the best way to, educate the average American about energy? Yeah,
that's a great question. I think there is already a resurgence of people thinking about nuclear. And so there's already, I think, a bit of a sentiment change happening. I've noticed a lot more people starting to talk about it, starting to think about it. And I think those efforts will continue. I think my piece of that, just to answer it for myself, is I think if we're successful here and we do end up generating a lot of U.S. power very cheaply using nuclear energy, just offshore, I think that will cause a perception shift. Like, oh, my gas is way cheaper. My electric bill is way cheaper. And, pointing to nuclear energy for that is a big thing. But also this just goes to a more general thing. Like, we need more rigorous education in the United States. People need to actually be able to understand basic math, basic physics. This stuff is actually not complicated. One of the things that people completely misunderstand about nuclear is that they perceive these things as like, being incredibly complex, having to, be products of massive like fleets of scientists and engineers just to get anything simple. And I just like to pull out pictures of like what Oak Ridge looked like, what Los Alamos looked like. It's like, actually, it's just kind of dudes with hammers building stuff. That's where nuclear started. So yeah, I think that there's definitely, public messaging with, there are various organizations who, advocacy groups who are working on that. But yeah, also just like in the education system in general, we need to start to take responsibility as Americans for our own energy, our own industries, and really own this stuff. Stop exporting it.
Do you think it's been a particular right versus left issue? Like, is there a political party that's particularly better on energy, or is everyone kind of afraid of phone calls from constituents?
I think everyone's afraid of phone calls. Obviously, Republicans are a little bit better on energy. Maybe you could say significantly better on energy, but they're still sort of subject to popular opinion. I think, natural gas and oil refinement, like tons of it is in Texas, North Dakota, like very Republican states. And, that's definitely because of those political allegiances. But I think that these types of differences don't matter so much when we're dealing with an order of magnitude difference in technology. So there's certain technologies that come along that are so different, so much better that they can transcend, the normal political boundaries. If you're talking about solar and wind, it's suddenly super political because the marginal differences between these technologies and what we have now are super tiny. They might be a little bit cheaper, or they might be a little bit more expensive, and we have to get this subsidy in order for them to work. That's where it gets super political. Yeah. But when you walk in and you say, look, this is like 10 times cheaper, that can transcend some political boundaries because everybody wants everything around them to be cheaper.
Isaiah, where can people find you, keep up with the great work that you're doing, if they're so inclined after listening to this great episode?
You can find me on x.com, as it's now called, formerly, the app formerly known as Twitter. Isaiah_P_Taylor. And thank you so much for having me on, Nick.
Yeah, thanks for coming. I really appreciate it, especially on so short notice. We literally talked about doing this episode last week, and next day you texted me, you were like, cool, my flight's booked. Let's do it.
Let's go. Yep, always, man. Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. I told you that would be a very fascinating episode. I can guarantee you that I'm going to be on Wikipedia for the rest of the evening looking up all the things that he talked about. I had to do a lot of research ahead of time to feel equipped enough to do this podcast episode, but I'm very grateful to Isaiah for explaining things in such a simple way for my simple brain. So thank you again for joining us for this episode of Moment of Truth. We'll be back again next Monday. As always, please rate and review the podcast, 5 stars only. Please feel free to leave a review. You can check us out at americanmoment.org. You can follow me on Twitter at Nick S. Solheim. That's SOLHEIM. And you can follow American Moment on Twitter, or I should be saying X, I guess, at AMMoment.org. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.
Moment of Truth is an American Moment Studios production filmed at the Conservative Partnership Center. Our podcast is produced and edited by Jake Mercier and Jared Cummings. Our intro music is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich. Don't forget to like and subscribe on all platforms, and you can go to AmericanMoment.org to learn more.